The Americans considered Pearl Harbor one of the most significant war betrayals in their history. For that reason, they were determined to punish and teach Japan in every possible way. Immediately after the Japanese attack on their naval force, the United States issued an order urging, quite urgently, all countries aligned against the Axis to detain and isolate their residents of Japanese descent, fearing they could become potential enemies in Allied territories. This directive even reached Latin America, which was minimally involved in the war. In this video, we will tell you how this event was organized in different Latin American countries and the consequences it had on innocent Japanese communities. Welcome once again to Military History, and get ready for a journey back in time. Let's begin. Very surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 by the Japanese Army not only drew the United States into World War II, but also accelerated an ethnic-based policy rather than military intelligence that the U.S. government already had in motion. After the attack, Washington began concentrating Japanese immigrants for close surveillance and asked other countries in the region to follow suit. Between 1942 and 1945, an alarming number of Japanese or people of Japanese descent were interned in camps, as happened in some South American countries. This measure also targeted Germans and Italians under the same extreme suspicion, considering these citizens could conspire or be agents of the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis. Roosevelt took charge of creating regulations to organize the procedure.
Executive Order 9066, signed by Franklin Roosevelt, was a very antiseptic sounding process to remove Japanese American citizens from their homes in California, Washington, and Oregon, ripping people off the land because of what they look like.
The internment was executed carefully and systematically, as planned. Japanese Americans were confined in various concentration camps in the central United States, under truly deplorable conditions. The 150 buildings originally constructed to house migrant workers during the Great Depression were fenced with high barriers and watchtowers, turning them into detention centers. The facilities had armed guards overseeing supposed enemies of the United States, including women, the elderly, and children. Overcrowding was a significant problem, complicating the living conditions for the detainees. One of the most famous camps was located in the town of Crystal City, south of San Antonio. In this camp, over 4,000 people, mostly Japanese but also Germans and Italians, from Latin American countries, were concentrated. In this camp, prisoners were forced to work to survive and collaborate with the U.S. government. Although the tasks were not forced, the working conditions were truly humiliating. In general, any activity in Crystal City was paid at 10 cents per hour of work, making it difficult for detained Japanese families to buy only basic food and barely a soap, shared among many. Living conditions were precarious, as detailed in another testimony.
El primer invierno que pasamos allí, creo que nevó a mediados de septiembre. Y ni siquiera teníamos abrigos. Éramos del sur de California y hacía calor cuando nos fuimos. Pero ese primer invierno fue tan frío, creo que fue el invierno más frío de la historia de Wyoming. Hubo temperaturas de unos 30 grados.
After achieving its goal in its own territory, the United States insisted that Latin American countries follow suit. Let's see what happened in some of these. Let's start with Panama. In January 1942, about 185 Japanese individuals were detained on Toboga Island in the Canal Zone. These seemingly arbitrary detentions were, in reality, a central concern of the U.S. military. The Panama Canal was a strategic point that had to be protected at any cost. After all, this connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans was vital for maintaining trade and the transport of war materials, which, if attacked or sabotaged, would affect not only the United States but the entire hemisphere. While the conditions of detention in Panama did not reach the extremes of German camps, they were extremely harsh. According to diplomatic documents, detained Japanese, including the elderly, were forced to perform intense physical labor, and they were only allowed to see their families for 10 minutes a day. They had to carry heavy wood, sharpen saws, and work the land. Sometimes, they were cruelly made to dig a hole and immediately forced to fill it again with the same soil. Those who tired were beaten and kicked. These prisoners would eventually find their destiny in the American dream. Another territory aligned with the United States and the Allies was Brazil, which implemented a policy similar to Panama. Throughout the Brazilian country, 11 concentration camps were opened for Japanese, Italian, and German residents. On April 17, 1942, the Japanese lost their property rights through a declaration of forfeiture, and the locality on the banks of the Akara River was isolated and turned into the Tomeatsu camp. Although the numbers are imprecise, it is estimated that in the 3 years of the camp's existence, around 480 Japanese families, 32 German families, and some Italian families were detained in this place. Throughout history, concentration camps have taken various forms. In the case of Tomeatsu, it was formed from an immigrant colony that was isolated within a delimited territory. As it was a population lost in the Amazon, accessible only by boat, when the state controlled the boats, the community ended up completely isolated. Many immigrants were not forced to stay in a cell, but they also had nowhere to stay or means to feed themselves, causing problems in the community, even leading to some deaths. After the Pearl Harbor attack, in Brazil, the Japanese language was banned, and many symbols of that culture were censored or even became illegal. The Japanese population was heavily persecuted and discriminated against in that country throughout the war. However, things did not improve for Brazilian Japanese when the conflict ended. Later on, the bloodthirsty Japanese organization Shindo Renmei, based in Sao Paulo, composed of those who did not accept Emperor Hirohito's surrender in World War II, hunted and killed other Japanese who had accepted defeat, accusing them of betraying the homeland. In the lands of Colombia, incarcerated Japanese communities did not fare any better. Lights out for sleep and reveille to wake up, visits only from family twice a week, and correspondence only written in Spanish, subject to review by local authorities. Books, magazines, and newspapers had to be authorized, and alcoholic beverages were completely prohibited, as were radios and cameras. Forced labor and meager wages that turned tasks into slave labor. These were some of the rules for inmates at the Fusagasuga concentration camp, the nearly forgotten facility that Colombia established to detain Germans and Japanese toward the end of World War II. By 1940, there was a small community of Japanese immigrants and citizens in Mexico who suffered because the local government was allied and complied with U.S. pressures. There were imprisonments and relocations in which the Japanese had only 8 days to leave their homes in different parts of the country and be transferred to detention centers. Consequently, there were expulsions, detentions without charges, and the obligation to register with immigration offices for citizens of Axis countries. In just 3 weeks in December 1941, the lives of Japanese in Mexico had turned upside down. They were under surveillance, with barely enough money to survive, and forced to leave their homes. The main U.S. interest was to keep them especially away from the area near their border, considering their presence there could pose a danger to their security and a risk of espionage. The chosen place for confinement was the old Temixco Hacienda, located about 100 kilometers south of Mexico City, where about 600 people were interned and could be controlled by Mexican authorities. Temixco was not a Nazi extermination camp or one of the internment camps in the United States. The entrance was guarded by army members, but let's say it was lax surveillance. Although there were no punishments or forced labor, the drama for these innocent Japanese was that they were forced to live in truly sad and austere conditions solely because of their Japanese ancestry. Many of them developed health and socialization problems due to growing up in an environment similar to a prison. However, Peruvian Japanese had a much more tragic fate. In the case of Peru, instead of installing a concentration camp in the territory, all prisoners of Japanese origin were deported to the United States. The Japanese had to be detained and sent to the northern country, where they would serve a rather sinister function for the American armies. Around 2,300 people were brought from 12 Latin American countries to internment centers in the United States. And according to a 1982 U.S. government investigation, more than 80% of them came from Peru. It must be explained that people in Peru were often very racist towards the Japanese, even before World War II and Pearl Harbor. Stories of successful businesses were common among Japanese origin families in that country and others in Latin America. In Peru, this prosperity led to a strongly anti-Japanese sentiment. In May 1940, this country experienced a wave of looting that ended with the destruction of about 600 businesses, homes, and schools owned by citizens of Japanese descent. Despite these affronts and subsequent incarceration, the Japanese people kept their heads high, as the following testimony recounts.
Things taken away from them, their business, their livelihood. You can see they're still proud, though, the people. They're very proud and dignified during this tragic moment in their lives where everything's turned upside down.
Peruvian authorities, at the behest of the Washington government, began compiling blacklists with the names of prominent members of the Japanese community who would all end up in American internment camps. Next would come the confiscation of their property and their imprisonment, culminating in the deportation of entire families to the United States. And why did Washington want the Japanese from Peru and other 12 Latin American nations? The answer is as simple as it is perverse: to use them in the exchange of prisoners with the Tokyo government, which in turn had captured hundreds of Americans. As we mentioned earlier, many detained Japanese from Latin America were concentrated in Panama and would eventually be taken to the southern United States, to internment camps where there were also people of German and Italian origin. These were detention centers where entire families, including many children, were interned. Here we can see images of one of these camps. While these were not extermination sites, this did not mean they were not concentration camps. The detentions that crowded the Japanese in these places were racist, as they were based on the ethnic origin of the prisoners, not on being found guilty of something. As recorded in diplomatic documents, many of these deported Japanese were used as currency for exchange with the Japanese Empire for Americans who were being held captive. During 1944, two significant exchanges were made, involving more than 1,000 Japanese Peruvians who were forcibly forced to return to Japan aboard a Swedish-flagged ship used during the war for prisoner transactions. Khaled Gripsholm. The end of the war between Japan and the United States in August 1945 did not bring freedom and peace for all the thousands of Japanese immigrants residing in various Latin American countries. Particularly for those who were forcibly transferred to internment camps in the United States, their future remained uncertain because they did not know whether they would be repatriated to Japan or if they could return to the countries where they had lived most of their lives and where their children were born. They had been used by the Americans as a bargaining chip. Now they were without a homeland, and no country, neither their captors nor their homeland, wanted them on their territory. Of the more than 2,200 Latin American Japanese who were interned in U.S. internment camps, a total of 1,260 were used in the prisoner exchanges Washington conducted with the Tokyo government. At the end of World War II, due to the refusal of Peru and other Latin American governments to receive them, the vast majority of the remaining individuals were deported to Japan. Around 350 Latin American citizens of Japanese origin refused to be sent to Japan, managing to remain in U.S. territory thanks to the intervention of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU for short. After losing everything they had built in Peru through decades of effort, these prisoners of war had to start from scratch in an unfamiliar land. All of this happened because they were apprehended for a strictly prejudiced and ethnic reason. The worst part is that this procedure, as explained by the following specialist, was done silently and clandestinely.
This was only happening in scattered spots all along the West Coast. It was very hush-hush. The papers barely mentioned it. The public didn't realize what was going on. They were ripped out of their homes, and it was so hard to photograph that. It was so hard because those people were stoic. They were told that you go like we tell you to as part of fighting the war. And they went. They went quietly. They were not crying. They were being good citizens.
So even today, many people are unaware that this happened. In the rest of the countries, such as Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, internment lasted until 1945, when the camps were closed after the end of the war. However, the consequences of this period of persecution would persist for generations, reminding people of what was a nightmarish racial persecution. So we come to the end of the video today. Leave your opinions in the comments below. We appreciate you for reaching the end and look forward to the next installments of military history.